This is the Carlinian Studio. I am your host, Charles Lathrop. Today I want to talk to you about something that's been on my mind for a while. I've been following Dr. Jordan Peterson on YouTube, and I've noticed that he spends a lot of time talking about Christianity and Christian theology. Right now, I'd like to focus on his analysis of Cain and Abel, because I believe it is a story which is crucial to understanding the Bible. If a person can interpret the story of Cain and Abel correctly, it will help them in understanding the entire Bible. But if a person interprets the story incorrectly, they will probably misinterpret the rest of the Bible. Dr. Peterson's analysis is flawed for a few specific reasons. Now, the story of Cain and Abel is not particularly long or complicated in the literal events which take place. The rub is in interpreting the actual significance of these events. I'm not going to get into all the details of Dr. Peterson's interpretation. There are plenty of videos on YouTube which specifically address his interpretations of various biblical stories, including Cain and Abel, and if the viewer is interested further, they can look for these sources. I'm just going to jump into the story and relate it to Dr. Peterson's interpretation as I go. The story of Cain and Abel begins with the brothers offering sacrifices to God. God looks favorably upon Abel's sacrifice, and he looks unfavorably on Cain's sacrifice. Now, the first point where I differ from Dr. Peterson is right here. He states that it is unclear why Cain's sacrifice was rejected, but this is not the case. If the story is read carefully, it is abundantly clear that the sacrifices of Cain and Abel differ fundamentally. According to Genesis 4:2, Abel kept flocks of sheep and Cain worked the soil. So, the sacrifice of Cain was a sacrifice of vegetables and produce, but the sacrifice of Abel was a sacrifice of flesh from the firstborn of his flock. This distinction is critical to the story and to the Bible. It is something that Dr. Peterson unfortunately ignores. The fact is that his inability to distinguish between the nature of the two sacrifices and the qualitative differences between them causes interpretation of the entire Bible to completely break down. It has been presumed by Peterson that Cain was rejected on account of his sin. This is drawn from later in the story when God comes to Cain and tells him that sin is crouching at his door. More on this later. However, this interpretation makes no sense. Given not only the context of the Bible as a whole, but also the context provided by the Bible up to the story of Cain and Abel. It is the case that human beings being infected by sin is a condition which originates with Adam. It is by no means obvious that the sin of Cain was for any reason greater or more severe than the sins of any other human being at the time. The real question here is why the sacrifices were being offered in the first place. It is obvious to anyone who studies the Bible for any length of time that in the vast majority of cases, these sorts of sacrifices are made specifically for covering sin. Therefore, it makes no sense for God to reject an offering made specifically for covering sin on account of the sin which the offering is supposed to cover in the first place, unless there is something wrong with the offering itself. So, why are offerings being made to cover sin? Or perhaps, more accurately, how is it possible that these sorts of offerings are able to cover sins at all? From the story of Adam and Eve, we understand that the penalty for disobeying God is death. When God tells Adam not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he tells him, "In the day you eat of it, dying you shall die." However, when Adam and Eve actually do eat of the tree, God kills animals instead and uses the skins of the animals to clothe Adam and Eve. From then on, throughout the Bible, until the New Testament sacrifice of Jesus, at any time a sacrifice is for sin is offered, it is always a sacrifice of blood, with one exception, that being Cain. In Hebrews 9, Paul explains this concept in detail, describing how the law that Moses gave to the people of Israel demands that nearly everything be sprinkled in blood, including the people themselves. It is a theme throughout the course of the Bible, from the covenant with Abraham before the law was given, to Moses, and to Jesus, who gave his life on a cross, that in order to pay for sins, or even to cover them temporarily, it was necessary for blood to be shed. This is why Cain's offering was rejected, because he offered vegetables instead of blood. Right from the beginning of the Bible, as was previously mentioned, when Adam and Eve sin, God kills two animals and covers Adam and Eve with the skins. These two sacrifices were made so that the penalty for death, which was hanging over Adam and Eve, would be postponed. For this reason, in Hebrews 10, it's described how in the Old Covenant that Moses received, the priests of the law stood continually offering the same sacrifices year after year in order to cover the sins of the people of Israel. Conversely, when Christ offered one sacrifice for sins for all time, he sat down at the right hand of God, where the priests of the Jewish law were continually standing, continually offering sacrifices. It should be clear to the listener now why misinterpreting the story of Cain and Abel quickly leads to a complete and utter misinterpretation of the whole of Christianity. The absolute necessity of a blood sacrifice for sins is the critical requirement which brought Jesus to the earth. Without understanding this principle, it is impossible to understand Christianity. According to Hebrews 8, the arrival of Jesus signals the end of the covenant under the law, because his sacrifices make all other sacrifices superfluous. Dr. Peterson often says that the offering of sacrifices is a negotiation with the future. While it is beyond the scope of this video, it bears mentioning here that this interpretation of the sacrifice, while not being entirely unfounded, is really tangential to the primary purpose of sacrifice, which is to bring the individual into right relationship with God. This may be interpreted in such a way as to indicate a negotiation with the future. However, while that's not technically untrue, it's an oversimplification. The primary conflict between Cain and Abel is not motivated by any differences between Cain's failure and Abel's success, either on or off camera. The primary conflict between them, just as the primary conflict between Isaac and Ishmael, is really a conflict about how one relates to God. The first murder ever committed, according to the Bible, was committed primarily over a disagreement about how human beings are to relate to God. It has nothing to do with any secret or private sins in Cain's life which caused him to be rejected. It has everything to do with the nature of the sacrifice he offered and his attitude in approaching God. It bears pointing out, in the case of counterarguments that may arise, that Dr. Peterson's interpretation of sin crouching at Cain's door is ridiculous. He characterizes it as a sexually aroused cat, which is planning to violate Cain. I'm not sure where this picture originates, but it should be noted from the word that the word for sin in this instance is the same word as the word for sin offering. And the description of sin's desire being for Cain is the same word used to describe Eve when God says your desire will be for your husband. Given what we've observed so far, and given that the Hebrew word for sin in this line is literally always translated in every other instance in which it appears as being a sin offering, it is much more reasonable to believe that God literally brought a literal lamb to Cain's tent and made it lie down so that Cain could take it and offer it as a sin offering to God. In other words, God told Cain a sin offering was crouching at his door, wanting Cain to sacrifice it so that he could be in right standing with God, and Cain still rejected this path, instead murdering Abel. This brings me to my final point, which is that the working of the fields takes a great deal more actual labor than raising and tending sheep. In other words, Cain brought the product of his sweat and was enraged with jealousy because his worthiness was rejected, while in contrast, Abel did not work and was accepted. This is the central issue of the Bible. Will man climb up to God, or will man submit to God, receiving God to descend to man? In the first case, man relies entirely on his own strength in order to be worthy of a right standing with God. In the second case, God is the one who does the work and creates an environment where man may receive right standing apart from his own efforts. It should be clear to the viewer that Cain was not rejected on account of his sin, but rather on account of his pride. He was determined not to offer the blood of an animal, which he did not work to produce. Rather, he was determined to work to produce fruits and vegetables, the product of his own labor, to offer as a sacrifice to buy God's favor and clemency. This is why any interpretation of the story which proposes that Cain was rejected on account of his sin entirely misses the point of not only this story, but of the entire Bible. To attribute Cain's rejection to whether or not he was sinful is actually to side with Cain, for the simple reason that for Cain it was never about God's grace, but only about his own worthiness. In point of fact, when Dr. Peterson indicates that Cain was rejected on account of Cain's sin, he is actually moving the entire story into Cain's own point of view. And I don't mean, in this instance, the perspective of the person Cain. I mean to say Dr. Peterson's interpretation of the story literally moves the entire discussion into the territory of that which Cain embodies. Because any focus which brings attention to the worthiness of man presumes that it is possible for man by his worthiness to earn the favor of God, which is exactly the mistake that got Cain into trouble in the first place. Peterson's interpretation of the story of Cain and Abel takes Cain's side for all intents and purposes, which frankly should alarm anyone who's been relying on his interpretations of the Bible for a serious understanding of Christian theology. This has been the Carlinian Studio. I am your host, Charles Lathrop. If you like this video, please like, share, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. God bless.